Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, December 13th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. President Biden criticizes Israel's Gaza bombing, but vows to continue supporting it. So President Biden on Tuesday said Israel was losing global support due to its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, which has been supported by unconditional U.S. military aid. And Biden also criticized certain elements of the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So Biden told donors at a fundraising event, quote, Israel's security can rest on the United States, but right now it has more than the United States. It has the European Union, it has Europe, it has most of the world supporting it. But they're starting to lose that support by the indiscriminate bombing that's taking place, end quote. So despite labeling the Israeli campaign as indiscriminate, Biden said the U.S. will continue to provide military assistance, which involves shipping all these bombs over there, all sorts of military equipment. Biden said, quote, the literal security of Israel as an independent Jewish state is literally at stake, but it is unshakable, our commitment to Israel. We continue to provide military assistance to Israel as it goes after Hamas, end quote. So Biden said that Netanyahu justified his slaughter in Gaza by pointing to U.S. and allied bombings in World War II. And as that story I covered yesterday said, the destruction in northern Gaza is comparable to the most heavily bombed German cities of World War II. That's really incredible. I mean that in a bad way. It's incredible in a horrible way. So it's just interesting to see Biden say this. So he said, quote, it was pointed out to me that by Bibi that, well, you carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atom bomb, a lot of civilians died, end quote. So that's what Biden said Netanyahu told him. And Biden said he replied by saying, quote, that's why all these institutions were set up after World War II to see that it didn't happen again, end quote. And Biden added that Israel should also not repeat the same mistakes the U.S. made after 9/11 and said the U.S. should never have fought the war in Afghanistan, which is a pretty interesting thing to hear a president say. He said it in his kind of Biden way, kind of jumbled. Biden said, quote, don't make the same mistakes we made at 9/11. There was no reason why we had to be in a war in Afghanistan at 9/11. There was no reason why we had to do some of the things we did, end quote. So Biden called Netanyahu a good friend, but said he needs to change his government and singled out Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's an extremist settler who leads the Jewish Power Party in Israel, and he currently serves as Israel's Minister of National Security. The Jewish Power Party was the only faction in Netanyahu's cabinet that voted against the hostage deal with Hamas that involved a pause in Israel's bombardment. Biden said, quote, Ben-Gvir is not what you would call someone who, this is the most conservative government in Israel's history, the most conservative, end quote. I put the exact Biden quote in there, so it is a little tough to follow, but you get what he's saying. And he also said that Ben-Gvir and company and others like him do not want anything to do with a two-state solution. The same can be said for Netanyahu. Netanyahu has been selling himself. There was a report in Israeli media recently that he told Likud members, in an effort to get them to continue supporting him, that he's the only one who could prevent a two-state solution. So despite this criticism of the Netanyahu government, Biden made his strong support for the state of Israel clear. He said, quote, many of you heard me say over the years, were there not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. We'd have to invent one, end quote. So, the headlines that I saw today where Biden calls Israel's bombing indiscriminate. For a second, I thought maybe it was a change in something, but turns out he's still saying that they're going to support them. And Biden says a lot of things. I remember I believe it was September or October of last year when he said the world was closer to nuclear Armageddon than ever before. And he said that at a fundraising event. And, I thought because he said that, that means there must be some part of him that realizes how dangerous this policy of supporting Ukraine in this proxy war against Russia is. And okay, if he's acknowledging it, then maybe that means they're going to think about winding it down. But I was very wrong about that. So, I try not to read too much into what Biden says, but, he's basically just saying we're going to continue supporting this thing and kind of paying this lip service to the idea of criticism, keeping the criticism mostly to Netanyahu and his government, not so much Israel itself. All right, so the next one here, UN General Assembly overwhelmingly votes for a Gaza ceasefire. So the UN General Assembly on Tuesday voted overwhelmingly to adopt a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza as global opposition to the U.S.-backed Israeli massacre of Palestinians continues to rise. Out of the 193 members of the General Assembly, 153 countries supported the resolution, 10 voted against it, and 23 abstained. So the countries that joined, obviously, the U.S. and Israel were two of the countries that voted against it. The other 8 include Austria, Czechia, Guatemala, Liberia, Micronesia, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, and Paraguay. So the U.S. was not joined by very many countries in opposing a ceasefire. The resolution expresses, quote, grave concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the suffering of Palestinian civilian population, and emphasizing that the Palestinian and Israeli civilian populations must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law, and, quote, it demands an immediate ceasefire and an immediate release of all hostages. So last week, the U.S. vetoed a similar resolution at the UN Security Council that received support from 13 out of the 15 members, while the UK abstained from voting. But the U.S. does not have veto power on the General Assembly, so this was able to pass. And even though this resolution, there's no way to enforce it, it's non-binding, I think it still means something. It really demonstrates how the U.S. is isolating itself on the world stage by backing Israel's slaughter. Now, remember, Biden said that that Israel has the support of Europe. I don't see any European countries besides Austria that voted against this, and Czechia as well. But that's not, significant really. So I would say Biden is very wrong when he says Israel has support from most of the world. I think that's not true at all. And, I put the numbers in here again. The death toll is still, the latest is over 18,000. But the number of displaced, 90% of the 2.3 million people that live in Gaza have been displaced, have been moved out of their homes. I mean, that is a huge number of people that have been displaced. All right. So the next one here, Israel is reportedly pumping seawater into Hamas's Gaza tunnels. So this article is from the Wall Street Journal. I just kind of saw this last minute, so I put this article in that they have about it. And it cites U.S. officials who say that Israel's military has begun pumping seawater into Hamas's vast complex of tunnels in Gaza. And the move to flood the tunnels with water from the Mediterranean Sea is one of several techniques that Israel is using to try to clear and destroy the tunnels. Israeli officials say the Hamas's underground system has been key to its operations on the battlefield. And these U.S. officials speaking to the Wall Street Journal are saying that Israel has not done much damage to the tunnels. And using the seawater, again, there's going to be other ways. They're saying that flooding the tunnels with seawater will take weeks, likely be a weeks-long progress. And some Biden administration officials are concerned that using the seawater could endanger Gaza's fresh water supply. It could also impact farming and things like that. So, again, this is just a report from the Wall Street Journal. I know Biden was asked about it, and his response was, what about the hostages? Or he referred to the hostages. And that is a good question, because the hostages are probably down in the tunnels. So flooding them with seawater could definitely put them in danger. All right, so the next one here, aid groups say that major changes are needed to pull Gaza back from the abyss. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. A New York Times op-ed by the heads of 6 top international humanitarian organizations issued a dire warning about Gaza and demanded that President Joe Biden alter his unfettered support of Israel to help stop the horrific crisis that's unfolding. A senior UN official recently alerted that half of the people in Gaza are starving. So these humanitarian groups, which include CARE USA, Mercy Corps, Norwegian Refugee Council, Oxfam, Save the Children, and it's all the heads of them that wrote this op-ed. And they wrote, quote, "As the leaders of some of the world's largest global humanitarian organizations, we have seen nothing like the siege of Gaza. About 18,000 Gazans, including more than 7,500 children, have been killed. More children have been reported killed in this conflict than in all major global conflicts combined last year," end quote. They're basically saying that there's nothing they can do right now to address the humanitarian crisis. The siege needs to stop, and their jobs have become impossible. They said, quote, "The aerial bombardments have rendered our jobs impossible. The withholding of water, fuel, food, and other basic goods has created an enormous scale of need that aid alone cannot offset," end quote. So you see the U.S. saying, yeah, we're giving Israel all these bombs, but we're also pressuring them to let these aid trucks in. But, it's almost every day now we see the UN and aid groups, NGOs, charities that operate in Gaza saying their relief efforts have completely broken down. And it doesn't matter how many of these aid trucks get in. I mean, it's just, considering what's happening in Gaza, it's not doing anything. All right, so the next one here is a bad story. I guess you could say that for most things I go over. But the next one, the U.S. threatens to kill Yemen peace deal. So the U.S. is threatening to kill a peace plan for Yemen that was negotiated between the Houthis and the Saudis if the Houthis continue attacking shipping in the Red Sea, which the group has been doing in response to Israel's assault on Gaza. So The Guardian reported that the Houthis and Saudis have reached a peace deal that could satisfy all major parties involved in the conflict. Even the Southern Transition Council, they're a UAE-backed group that wants to see the restoration of North and South Yemen as 2 separate countries, as they were before Yemen was unified in 1990. So the Southern Transition Council, that's the STC, they want to restore South Yemen, and they want to separate South Yemen from North Yemen, which there were 2 separate countries until 1990. And the territory that the Houthis control is pretty much all of what used to be North Yemen. And so, it sounds like splitting up the countries again could be a deal. I don't really see what the problem is, because you have 2 groups that control most of the territory who, I don't think mind being separated. So the peace plan has been presented to the UN, but the details have not been disclosed to the public. I was not aware that there was actually kind of a deal that they reached and gave to the UN. According to The Guardian, the agreement involves 3 phases and a potential U.S. plan to redesignate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization could prevent the first phase from being implemented. The first phase involves depositing money into accounts for the payment of civil salaries for workers in Houthi-controlled areas, and also it would fully open airports and seaports that have been under blockade since 2015. A U.S. terrorist designation would mean that any entity that does business with the Houthis would be subject to U.S. sanctions, making both steps impossible to implement without the parties involved facing penalties. So the White House said last month that it was considering redesignating the Houthis as terrorists in response to the attacks in the Red Sea and the Houthi missile and drone launches toward Israel. The Trump administration labeled the Houthis as terrorists in January 2021. It was kind of a last-minute foreign policy move by Mike Pompeo. He did it despite all these aid groups warning that it would doom the food-deprived Yemenis living in Houthi-controlled areas. The Trump administration did it anyway. Biden came in, and they reversed it pretty quickly. In February 2021, it was reversed. So the Houthis, again, they they govern the Yemeni capital of Sana'a and the territory that used to be North Yemen. And it's where 70 to 80% of Yemen's population lives. So it's where most Yemenis live. So kind of criminalizing the delivery of aid to those areas could be very bad, obviously. And civilians in Houthi-controlled territory have faced dire food shortages due to the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war and blockade that started in 2015. According to the UN, the war has killed at least 377,000 people. More than half died due to starvation and disease caused by the siege. Yemenis have had some relief as a ceasefire that was reached in April 2022 has held relatively well, and the blockade has been eased somewhat, but according to the UN, about 2/3 of the population is still reliant on aid. Until the Yemen peace plan is implemented, there's always a risk of the war reigniting, especially if the U.S. or Israel bomb the Houthis in response to the attacks on the Red Sea. So I thought something that this Guardian report said, I thought was just a good way to phrase what the U.S. is doing here. The report said that the U.S. warning to the Houthis, warning that they'll derail the peace deal, threatening that, demonstrates the price that the U.S. is willing to pay to continue supporting Israel, to continue supporting this brutal assault on Gaza, even if they have to disrupt, start another war again. It's a price that they're willing to pay. And the Houthis are not backing down, as this next story demonstrates. The Houthis claim a missile attack on a Norway-flagged ship in the Red Sea. So Yemen's Houthis have taken credit for a missile attack on a Norwegian-flagged tanker in the Red Sea. And this is their latest operation aimed at disrupting shipping in response to Israel's assault on Gaza. The Houthis, known as Ansar Allah, claimed the ship, the Strinda, was headed to Israel, while the vessel's operator and ship tracking data said it was bound for Italy. The attack came after the Houthis warned that all ships in the area that were sailing to Israel were potential targets. So the ship was struck as it passed through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which separates Yemen and East Africa. Houthi spokesman Brigadier General Yahya Sari said Houthi forces fired on the ship after it rejected all warning calls. U.S. Central Command said that a U.S. Navy destroyer responded to SOS calls from the ship, but was not in the area when it came under attack. So these attacks, again, risk the U.S. There's always a chance of the U.S. bombing the Houthis directly, or Israel saying that they'll attack them if the U.S. and its allies don't. And now these threats, this foreign terrorist designation, again, could really spark things in Yemen. And this is just another example of how Israel's war in Gaza is spilling out into the region. You also have the tensions between Israel and Lebanon, and the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, and the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. There's a lot of areas where things could really spiral out of control. In Yemen, I mean, if this war restarts again, it's interesting to see what the Saudis will do, because the Saudis are in kind of an awkward position, because they're, they don't want to look like they're on the side of Israel and the U.S., but the U.S. does back them and prop up their military in this war against the Houthis, so they kind of need that support. So there's a lot of different ways, I guess, this could all play out. All right, I have to mention that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com, and right now we have matching funds. So this is how this show is made, is through antiwar.com, and antiwar.com is entirely reader funded. That's how we're able to provide you with news and analysis and viewpoints from our staunchly anti-war, non-interventionist perspective. So go to antiwar.com/donate, see the different ways that you can support us: credit card, PayPal, crypto. I appreciate everybody that's helped us out so far, and everybody that has helped us out in the past. Again, it's tough to ask people for money, but this is how we have to do it. So please help us out, get this fundraiser going if you have the means. We really appreciate it. All right, back to the news here. Hamas denies that its battalions have been significantly degraded. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it's what Hamas is saying about their own casualties, and basically saying that they haven't, Israel's not doing too much damage to them. So senior Hamas members have denied reports that the group's Gaza battalions have been significantly degraded, days after the Israeli military said 5 influential Hamas commanders had been killed. Last week, Israel's military released a photo that said it included the names and faces of recently slain Hamas commanders who led battalions and brigades in northern Gaza. The Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, confirmed that at least 3 of the men had been killed, including Ahmed al-Gondor, the head of its northern brigade. Israel has since claimed that up to 5,000 fighters out of a total 30,000 from the Qassam brigades have been killed in the past 2 months of fighting. And I know in the thing I went over yesterday, some were claiming 7,000. A Palestinian source close to Hamas's political leadership in exile rubbished the Israeli military's latest figures, telling Middle East Eye that the number of casualties among Qassam fighters was very low. When pressed for a number, the source said the total number of casualties is below 10%. So 10% of 30,000 would be 3,000. But this source said that Qassam is a military movement with a centralized structure and a loose organizational ring. We have not heard that the central forces have suffered serious casualties, except for some commanders who were outside the tunnels because of the fighting, end quote. The source's comments came days after Israeli forces arrested scores of Palestinian civilians sheltering near 2 UN-run schools in northern Gaza. The Israeli army had repeated the claim that between 10 to 15% of the arrested men belonged to Hamas. Didn't provide evidence for that claim. But anyway, so this is interesting to see what Hamas is saying about the damage that Israel is doing to them. I think I didn't make clear enough to some people yesterday that I don't believe Israel's numbers claiming that they killed 7,000 Hamas fighters. I mean, there's no reason to believe them considering all the lying that they're doing. And I'm not saying we should just take Hamas's word for it as well, but I think kind of this source speaking to Middle East Eye makes a good point about kind of the looseness of the structure of the Qassam brigades. And then, they're not the only militant faction in Gaza. There's also the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I'm sure that they're not having recruitment issues right now, considering how many young men are left without just had their families killed in airstrikes. I mean, there's probably so many that's happened to that are now going to pick up a rifle and fight the Israeli forces that are invading, whether or not they're technically part of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's just hard to believe that this isn't what Israel's doing isn't just going to make more and more fighters. And that's something that both Charles Q. Brown, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, have said that killing all these people in Gaza is just going to make more Hamas fighters. So, all right. So the next one here, Republicans tell Zelensky no Ukraine aid until border deal. So Zelensky was told by Republicans in Washington on Tuesday that Congress won't be authorizing new aid for Ukraine until a deal with Democrats on border issues can be reached. House Speaker Mike Johnson met with Zelensky and told him that Republicans support Ukraine but wouldn't send more aid until a transformative change in U.S. border policy and laws. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, a very staunch supporter of the Ukraine proxy war, said that it would be impossible to pass this massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan before Congress goes on its Christmas break. He said, quote, "It is practically impossible, even if we reach an agreement, to craft it, get it through the Senate, get it to the House before Christmas. There won't be a deal until Joe Biden and Republicans reach an agreement," end quote. So Senator Lindsey Graham, again, another very staunch Ukraine proxy war supporter, explained to Zelensky that the issue had nothing to do with Ukraine. He said that he told Zelensky, quote, "Here's the problem. It's got nothing to do with you," end quote. So even President Biden said that he could not make a promise to Zelensky. He said, quote, "We're in negotiations to get funding we need, not making promises, but hopeful we can get there. I think we can," end quote. So Zelensky spent his time in Washington pleading for more U.S. aid and told senators on Tuesday that he's considering conscripting men over 40 to help resolve Ukraine's manpower problem. Due to the heavy casualties Ukraine has suffered, the average age of Ukrainian soldiers is now 43. So that's pretty old, but they're not drafting men over 40. Under Ukraine's martial law, men ages between 18 and I believe 60 or maybe even 65 can't leave the country. But the conscription, they're not conscripting guys over 40, I guess, because he's saying now that they might expand it to that. But the average age at the beginning of the war was just over 30. So for propaganda purposes, I can't think of any other reason why else. Neither the U.S. nor Ukraine has shared the number of Ukrainian casualties incurred by the war since Russia invaded in February 2022. There was a U.S. intelligence report that was released on Tuesday that claimed Russia had suffered 315,000 casualties, which includes killed and wounded. But there's no way to confirm this number, and it was a very transparent effort to kind of help Zelensky pitch for more aid by the U.S. intelligence declassifying this estimate of Russian casualties that there's just no way to know if it's true at all. So they say 315,000 casualties total, killed and wounded. When this was first reported by the New York Times, and I saw some news channels report it this way, they said Russia has lost 315,000 soldiers, and that implies 315,000 dead, and that's the way it was presented initially, and that's way different than killed and wounded. If you look at the ratio of how many U.S. troops died in Afghanistan, let's say, it's roughly just over 2,000 were killed, but 20,000 were wounded. So think about that ratio when we're talking about killed and wounded. Now, the war in Ukraine is different than, fighting an insurgency. They're using weapons that have better chances of killing people, I'd say. But still, it's a huge difference between killed and total casualties. But anyway, I'm not going to trust these numbers coming from U.S. intelligence when they're trying to fund a war. That would be a foolish thing to do, to take them at their word. Russia hasn't been updating their casualty numbers either. So it's just very strange that we don't, that neither side is doing that. And the reason why I think they released this intelligence report is that we've seen this argument from people in Congress saying, Ukraine's not gaining any territory, but they're killing a lot of Russians. They sure are inflicting a lot of pain on the Russian military. And we're getting our money's worth because no Americans are dying. And, basically implying, who cares about the Ukrainians that are dying? And we've seen that argument from both sides of the aisle. I know Mitt Romney has made the argument, and Blumenthal in the Senate, the Democrat. So, that's their attitude is, we're sure are killing a lot of Russians. So Zelensky's going home empty-handed. But I think one point to make here is that the Republicans are not saying they're not going to pass the Ukraine aid. They're saying they want this border deal. So don't be surprised if they do end up passing another $60 billion to fund this war. It's just not going to be as soon as Zelensky would like. And I think he's hurting politically at home, and him just going over to the U.S. and basically begging to keep this war going, I think is just not going to bode well for him politically. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and Ukraine are looking for a new strategy in the war with Russia. So after Ukraine's failed counteroffensive, U.S. and Ukrainian officials are looking for a new strategy for the war against Russia, as political leadership in both nations is determined to keep the conflict going. So the New York Times reported on these discussions and said that the U.S. wants a more conservative strategy of Ukraine holding the territory it currently controls and building up its forces. The U.S. strategy also involves Ukraine building up its military-industrial complex to become less reliant on Western aid. U.S. officials told the Times that Ukrainian officials have unrealistic expectations of what the U.S. can continue to provide. The report said, quote, "They are asking for millions of rounds of artillery, for example, from Western stockpiles that do not exist. American officials say Ukraine will have to fight on a tighter budget," end quote. So the report said the Ukrainians are looking to go on the attack in some way to get the world's attention. U.S. officials are open to supporting more long-range Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which always risks a major Russian escalation. To form a new strategy, the U.S. has been dispatching a 3-star general to Kiev to spend lengthy periods of time in the Ukrainian capital, breaking from the policy of not sending military advisors to Kiev. So this is Lieutenant General Antonio Aguto Jr. He oversees support for Ukraine from a base in Germany, and now he's taken this role. So he's basically deployed to Ukraine as a military advisor. Now it says that he's spending having lengthy visits there. So it's not a long-term deployment, but long visits, kind of like trying to, I guess, get around this idea of that they still shouldn't send military advisors. So he's not permanently there. That seems to be the thing. But this is how something could be normalized. Very high-ranking U.S. military official being based in Kiev to give the Ukrainians advice. It's very provocative. Of course, the U.S. has done so much when it comes to being involved in this war that, it doesn't sound as provocative as giving Ukraine all these long-range weapons and helping their intelligence agencies attack Russia and all this stuff. But anyway, it does sound like a new form of support, a new form of U.S. involvement in the war. The report said that the goal of the U.S. strategy, known as Hold and Build, would be to create enough of a threat to Russia that Moscow would be open to negotiations either next year or in 2025. But from Russia's perspective, time is on their side, as it is clear the West's war fatigue is growing. And, I had to mention this story that now the U.S. is saying the goal is to put Ukraine on a good footing for negotiations. If they just let Ukraine and Russia negotiate in the beginning of the war, we know now, it was confirmed by the Ukrainian negotiator when they had talks in Istanbul in March 2022, that all Russia wanted, their main demand, was neutrality. The other stuff, denazification, didn't really matter. It was all about neutrality. The Ukrainian official said things like, we couldn't trust Russia for that. But he also said that Boris Johnson was in Kiev and told Zelensky not to negotiate and said, the West doesn't want to sign a deal with Russia. Let's keep fighting. So they scuttled peace talks at the beginning, and now Ukraine stands much more to lose. All the territory that Russia has annexed, they're not getting that back, and they could have gotten it back if the U.S. and NATO did not get in the way of that early peace deal. All right, so the last one here, NGOs call on ECOWAS to let aid into Niger. So this article is from Africa News, and it's kind of just an update. I haven't covered anything on Niger lately. The threat of war seems to have subsided. It seems like the U.S. worked out some kind of deal with the military, the new government that took over in the coup, to stay. The French were kicked out, but the U.S. is still there. There's about 1,100 U.S. troops. So now ECOWAS, the West African bloc of nations, put really harsh sanctions on Niger after the coup, and they still haven't lifted them. Excuse me. And they're not letting humanitarian aid enter Niger. So on Tuesday, international NGOs working in Niger called on ECOWAS to ease its sanctions against Niamey to allow emergency humanitarian aid to enter from neighboring Benin. The 20 or so organizations are calling for the immediate reopening of the border with Benin, which has been blocked because of regional sanctions, to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into Niger, where they say more than 4.3 million people need urgent assistance. So they're maintaining these sanctions, and there's no sign that they want to lift them. They're still demanding that the junta, relinquish power and all that. So the situation sounds pretty bad for the people in Niger who are bearing the brunt of these sanctions. At the same time, it seems like the junta has popular support. The people are happy that France is gone, which seems to be a pattern across West Africa. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder. The world has spoken on Gaza. The U.S. stands alone. One from John Mearsheimer, death and destruction in Gaza. Very strong statement on what he views as a massacre that Israel's committing in Gaza. One from William Hartung, hyped China fears driving a high-tech arms race. One from James Bovard, stop the Biden Big Brother Better law. And then our spotlight is from Michelle Nunn. The U.S. must change course on Gaza today. That's actually from the 6 aid workers, aid group leaders. That's the op-ed in the New York Times that they wrote. So go check all that out. That's it for me for today. I went a little longer today. There's just so much kind of big stories today. But please help us out with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. You could also help by just subscribing to the YouTube channel or on Rumble, Odyssey. If you listen to the podcast, you can leave a rating or a review depending on where you listen to the audio. Follow us on Twitter. But I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.